Back when Security Breach originally came out, some of the first theories MatPat presented about it on Game Theory were that the player character Gregory was secretly a robot recreation of William Afton's youngest son. Now that we have the Mimic as a character to potentially explain some things that Game Theory couldn't have known when those videos first came out, most theories about who Gregory is and what's going on with him during the games have mostly put the idea that Gregory is a robot version of the crying child to the side. But even if not everything from those theories works with what we know now, there were some things that MatPat did get right in those videos, such as the fact that Gregory is patient 46. So even if the theories aren't popular, would it be possible that he got other things right as well? Well, since it's been about 4.5 years, and the next FNAF game will potentially have us returning to Gregory's era of the timeline, I figured it was about time to revisit MatPat's old theories and see just how well not only those theories hold up, but also the more recent theories that have come out after Secret of the Mimic that take those original ideas and look at them from the perspective of that increased information we have. And while I think there are a lot of good points on all sides of the debate, I have a bit of a different idea for what the answer is than what's been proposed so far. So stay tuned and consider subscribing, because I'm going to explain what I think is most likely going on with Gregory and why that matters for the Five Nights at Freddy's story. But before I start, I have a quick announcement. For anyone who wasn't able to get the ID's Fantasy limited edition pin set when they were on sale last year, you're in luck, because the extras that were made for resolving issues with orders are now available on a final sale basis through the link in the description, pinned comment, and on-screen QR code. So if you missed the opportunity to get them before, now's your chance. There were only 25 left when they were put up for sale though, and once they're gone, that's it. So make sure you act fast so you can get your limited edition pin set before they sell out for good. Anyway, now that it's been almost half a decade since Security Breach came out, I think it's a good idea to go over the events of the game and have a refresher on the relevant story. As a note on this, I want to clarify that I will be treating Security Breach as though all the information we get in it is canon and potentially relevant to future games. A lot of people wrote off the game as a mess of non-canon lore after the most recent interview with the creator of the franchise, Scott Cawthon. Since Scott mentioned that his original intention for some things in the game, including the character that ended up as the final boss, ended up miscommunicated and taken in a direction that Scott didn't intend due to him not telling the development studio, Steel Wool, the actual story. However, I don't think that means Security Breach's lore is going to be written off for future entries. After all, Scott seemed pretty clear about how what ended up not happening was just the original plan, and specified that he wanted to be careful about what he said because he didn't want to mess with the lore. To me, that implies that what we got in Security Breach is going to be the version of the story that the future installments work with, and as such shouldn't be ignored, especially since Scott also mentioned that there were some things he did specifically tell them to include, and I think that probably applies to a lot of the things I'm going to be discussing in this video. Since we don't know what will and won't be important until we're told otherwise, I'm going to stick with Security Breach as a reliable reference point for information. Anyway, Security Breach starts off with the Glamrock animatronics starting a performance at Freddy Fazbear's Mega Pizzaplex, when the Glamrock Freddy animatronic looks into the crowd while performing and sees someone who his systems label a threat. Something about seeing this person, presumably Gregory, causes Freddy to glitch out on stage, and when he collapses, it gives Gregory the opportunity to crawl into his stomach hatch when he's pulled off stage and eventually moved to his green room. From there, Freddy wakes up and finds out about Gregory hiding, as well as that he isn't registered as a guest at the Pizzaplex, and that he's hiding from the security guard Vanessa, who Gregory says he doesn't know, but does know that she's trying to get him. The rest of the game progresses with Freddy helping Gregory escape, as Gregory simultaneously upgrades Freddy using parts from the other Glamrock animatronics he stole from them, and hides from both the Glamrocks and a woman in a rabbit costume named Fanny, who one ending of the game reveals to look exactly like Vanessa. At one point in the game, Gregory can use the Fazcam item to reveal a hidden door with a CD player, and one of Freddy's upgrades lets him find a bunch of retro CDs for it that contain recordings of the therapy sessions of two individuals, Vanessa and Patient 46, who is communicating with Vanessa, hacking her files, and offing the therapists when they start getting too close to the truth of the glitch trap related things going on, which Patient 46 has a direct hand in as the person who seems to have uploaded Glitch Trap to the Pizzaplex in the first place. While it was theorized as much by MatPat at the time, it was later pretty solidly confirmed that Patient 46 was actually Gregory. While the Tales from the Pizzaplex books don't take place in the main game timeline, they are like any FNAF book in that there are some things that carry over. And I would be pretty surprised if the kid named Greg, who looks young for his age, calls himself Dr. Rabbit when coming up with pen names, gets absurdly high scores at the Pizzaplex as GGY, and brings his therapists/school counselors to the Pizzaplex to kill them, isn't meant to be the same very young-looking Gregory hiding in the Pizzaplex, where there are arcade machines with high scores of GGY, and also recordings that heavily imply there's this kid going to therapists to keep an eye on Vanessa, with both of them being involved with an entity that looks like a rabbit. So while it's unclear if the exact events in the book happened in the games, the general gist of it presumably does carry over. This raises the question of why Gregory said he didn't know who Vanessa was if he was keeping an eye on her as Patient 46, but that's a topic for later. Meanwhile, there are a few other things in the room of note, such as the fact that it's set up to look almost identical to Michael Afton's living room as we see it in sister location, as well as a coded message on the wall that, when translated, has no punctuation and reads, "Break and mend, I built the breath they hunt, now drawn to life, not real, still keen, and frit and fraught with thought and zest and jest, no blunt woes. Dodge, duck, flash, shoot, crawl, run, crush the vile band, cry not, try not, do not hold out hope, know your life, your aim will save those with soul." That in particular is another can of worms to open later, but I mentioned it since dodge, duck, flash, shoot, crawl, run, crush the vile band seems to relate directly to Gregory's actions during Security Breach, where in addition to dodging, ducking, crawling, and running, he uses the Fazcam item to flash and the Phaser Blaster to shoot, and is pretty focused on crushing the vile band of the Glamrock animatronics. There's also these little areas where it looks like someone or multiple someones have either been living in or hiding out in the Pizzaplex. Since we know Gregory is trying to escape during Security Breach, MatPat's theories propose that some of these may have been his before he was able to escape, most notably one in the daycare where there are broken staff bots, as well as what's commonly referred to as the Post-it note room, which Gregory strangely does not react to despite reacting to other weird things in the game, and this room definitely being among the weirdest. Technically, these are more papers than sticky notes, but regardless, the room is covered in them, and each has some sort of scribbles, drawings, or writing on them. Additionally, the room contains a bunch of staffbot heads made to look like Nightmarionne, a nightmare version of the puppet animatronic from FNAF 2 and the cover character of Ultimate Custom Night. And this is in addition to a table with 5 staffbots that seemingly represent the Afton family. Once again, the implications of this room is a topic I will come back to later. Anyway, Security Breach has 6 total endings, half of which aren't super relevant to knowing who Gregory is and what's up with him, but there are some that have interesting implications or are important to be aware of for later events. For one, there's the ending where Gregory just leaves normally after talking to Freddy about how if he leaves, more people are going to go missing. In that ending, Gregory ends up sleeping in a box in an alleyway using a newspaper as a blanket that shows people have been going missing, one of whom looks like Gregory, before Vanny's silhouette falls over him. Another ending involves Gregory completing the Princess Quest games. He's not actually the first person to try and do so, but based on some of the notes that can be found in the game, someone can only play them if they have the princess's approval and go in order, which didn't work out for the previous people who tried. Since Gregory is able to play and beat them, he presumably has that approval and is able to use the games to cut off Glitch Trap's control of the Pizzaplex and those inside it. Afterwards, he, Freddy's head, and Vanessa are shown sitting on a hill together and eating ice cream. Alternatively, Gregory can finish crushing the vile band and upgrade Freddy with the parts from all of them. From there, they can head to the sinkhole under the Pizzaplex to find that the building was constructed on top of the Freddy's location from the game Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator, looking much less burned down than it ideally would if the plan to burn it and destroy all the haunted animatronics and such inside, including main villain of the franchise William Afton, had been successful. In the location, not only is there an amalgamation of animatronic spaghetti in the basement, but also what looks to be William Afton, just more decayed and overcooked than either his Springtrap or Scraptrap iterations, and with the addition of glowing purple eyes. As a note, this character Burntrap is often theorized to not actually be William, but rather a different character called the Mimic pretending to be William. If you're interested in my personal thoughts on that debate and how a lot of evidence gets misinterpreted or ignored, including but not limited to the Burntrap claw marks on the Mimic Room vents, I highly recommend checking out my most recent video on the topic. But in the meantime, either interpretation of who Burntrap is works for the purposes of this video, so I'll give explanations for both possibilities when necessary. Regardless, after Freddy takes Gregory down and has a whole speech about being used to clear the path, finding himself there, now having agency, and not being himself, Burntrap exits his charging pod and uses his glitch trap powers to hijack Freddy, and Gregory has to repeatedly set him on fire to get him to stop. Then Burntrap gets yoinked by the animatronic amalgamation while Freddy and Gregory escape. And since that's all the information MatPat had to work with when he first made his Gregory theories, minus the stuff I mentioned from the Tales from the Pizzaplex books of course, now is probably the best time to get into the details of what those game theories were and what evidence they used so we can compare them to the information we've gotten since then. Though speaking of game theory, some of you might know from GT Live that earlier this month I flew out to visit the headquarters for the Theorist channels, and because airplane tickets are expensive and I'd like to afford to live, I went with the cheapest flight available, which happened to include an extended overnight layover and no carry-on, which meant I had to sleep in an airport that was constantly lit with only what I could fit in my coat pockets because my backpack was full of a week and a half's worth of clothes. Fortunately, Manta Sleep's inflatable travel pillow was super easy to store deflated in my coat pocket, quick to inflate with a couple breaths, and comfortable to use with the position I chose out of the 4 different ways you can use it to support your head and neck. Plus, the latest version of the Manta Sound Sleep mask completely blocked out the light and made it so much easier for me to relax to music instead of just airport noise. And having used this one for the past few months, after previously using the old one for a while, let me tell you, the longer battery life and less bulky, more breathable design is so nice. But even outside of airport overnights, I genuinely enjoy and highly recommend both products if you're interested in high quality sleep gear. And hey, if you use the link in the description, pinned comment, and QR code, or code IDsFantasy, you'll not only get a 10% discount on your order, but also be helping support the channel so I can keep making videos and also afford to live. It helps more than you know, so make sure to check it out if you're interested. Anyway, the focus of the first set of game theories MatPat released after Security Breach were focused on the similarities between the three main characters, Gregory, Glamrock Freddy, and Vanessa, with the three children of William Afton. Gregory specifically is proposed to be a robotic recreation of the FNAF 4 crying child due to things like having similar hair color and styles, a shirt with 2 stripes, and a connection to a yellow bear in a bite since the crying child died after being bitten by the yellow Fredbear animatronic. Meanwhile, at the end of the Princess Quest ending, where all the characters look to be wearing or shaded in the color purple, which is commonly associated with the Aftons, Gregory is specifically shown with a yellow bear popsicle with a bite taken out of it. On top of that, in FNAF 4, the crying child is told that he's broken, while Glamrock Freddy says the same thing about Gregory in Security Breach. And on the topic of Glamrock Freddy, if Freddy were to be possessed by the crying child's older brother, Michael, as potentially implied by Freddy's whole I am not me speech during the burn trap ending, him saying he found himself when he cleared the path, the arsonistic tendencies, and a few other things would be explained, and it would be a satisfying narrative for Michael to finally succeed at saving the younger brother he failed in the past. Plus, Glamrock Chica talks about taking Gregory to his parents and knows his name despite Gregory not being in the Pizzaplex's systems. And since she's under the control of Burntrap/Glitchtrap, who either is or is imitating William Afton, it could mean she's saying she'll take the crying child to his father. Meanwhile, on the Robot Kid side of things, there's some details MatPat brought up, such as Gregory looking different to Freddy when Freddy gets Roxanne Wolf's X-ray eyes, as well as Gregory's own vision glitching out with CRT lines like the security cameras have when Vanny gets too close. After all, when Vanny approaches, there's a buzzing sound that is potentially what makes her invisible to animatronics that don't have Roxy's eyes, and in the FNAF books there were illusion discs that distorted footage cameras picked up and disguised things using audio frequencies. Plus, in the novel trilogy, William Afton kills his business partner Henry's daughter, and in his grief, Henry builds robot replicas of his daughter for each stage of her life, and no one notices, including her, until she's a teenager. So who's to say Gregory couldn't have been a similar situation with William rebuilding his son after his death? And then there's the post-it note room, full of dismantled staff bots, papers that seem to show the progression of a robot communicating in binary to actually drawing and writing, some of which could be interpreted as relating directly to the crying child. This is in addition to a table full of staff bots that directly correspond to each member of the Afton family, almost like there was a robot kid related to the Aftons coming into consciousness and piecing together who he was. And if he was assembling his family as robots in this room, maybe he, as Patient 46, was monitoring Vanessa and working with Glitchtrap to put his family back together like he was put back together as Gregory. Of course, this theory wasn't even the most popular at the time, with even MatPat raising questions about why Gregory would be helping Glitchtrap, stalking Vanessa, and offing therapists only to have such a drastic change of heart during Security Breach itself. Not to mention why the therapists would say Gregory had a good family life if he was a robot kid with nowhere to go after Security Breach. That would imply that there was a Gregory that actually existed for there to be records of his family, even if his parents had passed away at some point before the therapy tapes. Additionally, some pointed out that while there were robot people in the novel trilogy, they were made by Henry, not William, and William failed to replicate what Henry did outside of stealing one of his robots and having his daughter end up possessing it. So while yes, there are seemingly connections between Gregory and the crying child, most weren't convinced that they were fully literal and not just symbolic. Then as time went on and more games and books came out, people grew less and less confident in those ideas overall. The Tales from the Pizzaplex books show that yes, Gregory was Patient 46, but also that he had a life outside the Pizzaplex, and while it's since been revealed that the Tales books aren't directly taking place in the game continuity, the therapy tapes in the games indicate a very similar thing. And speaking of the games, eventually Security Breach got the Ruin DLC, where we play as Gregory's friend Cassie, the daughter of a Fazbear entertainment technician. Cassie was supposedly called to the Pizzaplex by Gregory, who was supposedly needing her help to get rescued from the pizzeria sinkhole. As Cassie travels the Pizzaplex, she gets a Vanny mask that lets her access an augmented reality, or AR, world that allows her to defy the laws of physics, as well as a Fazwrench that technicians like her dad would use to interact with some of the Pizzaplex technology, and a walkie-talkie that supposedly Gregory uses to communicate with her and tell her where to go. Of course, I'm saying supposedly so much because this wasn't actually Gregory, but rather an animatronic endoskeleton known as the Mimic, or M2, which was trapped behind a concrete wall and the mechanical X-Form experimental storage security system, which based on the most recent game, Secret of the Mimic, is likely a computer that also contained the original Mimic program M1. Despite what's presumably the real Gregory's attempts to warn Cassie, she ends up freeing M2, who attacks her after revealing that it was the one using the walkie-talkie to communicate with her. Gregory does manage to get in contact with her after Roxy protects her from M2, and he tells Cassie that he'd been trying to warn her that he's not actually at the Pizzaplex. However, now that the Mimic is free, she has to escape. So with the help of an unnamed friend of Gregory's who happens to have the building maps, Cassie needs to follow Static's instructions. While it's been theorized that this friend is someone like Vanessa, since Vanny had been active in the pizzeria simulator location, or even Freddy in the circumstance that he's possessed by someone like Michael Afton, who would have been in this location before, considering the fact that Gregory's backpack can be found in the room with Mixes, and Mixes at least in one point in time had the M1 Mimic program, which could imitate voices, I actually suspect that this friend was Mixes, and the reason the Static interrupted Gregory was because Mixes, or M1, had taken over using his voice. This would explain why it's Gregory's voice directing Cassie despite him not being the one with the maps, and the Static that we know comes into play when M1 interrupts and hijacks a signal to imitate the original individual coming in here. This would also explain Gregory's odd behavior after Cassie reaches the elevator when he starts talking to her again, this time over the intercom instead of through her walkie-talkie, and first explains to her the basics of what the Mimic is and that Mixes was containing it, only for there to be this strange overlapping text that appears alongside Static right when Gregory shifts from explaining and trying to rescue Cassie to dropping the elevator with her still inside it to apparently keep M2 from getting out. And when did you know it, there's a very prominent camera by the speaker that is very reminiscent of the one M1 had during Secret of the Mimic, but that's not the main topic of this video. Anyway, with the introduction of the Mimic as the main villain of Ruin, as well as the overarching Tales from the Pizzaplex story being about the Mimic, with nothing really pointing to the Aftons being relevant as anything but backstory, that recontextualized a lot of what we got in base game Security Breach and the information MatPat was using for those early post-release Security Breach theories. Overall, the majority opinions seem to be that Ruin was Scott getting the story back on track after Security Breach got backlash for the glitches and confusing lore, and in the process he threw out anything that seemed to imply previous characters or possession were returning to the story to focus solely on the Mimic instead, especially after the interview where Scott talked about his original plans being different from what Security Breach actually presented. However, when the newest game, Secret of the Mimic, came out, it threw a lot of things into question that had previously been taken as fact regarding the way the Mimic and its story worked, as well as the roles of both the Mimic and other characters in the modern story arc that may imply MatPat was more onto something than everyone thought. After all, most of the Mimic-based theories came from the fact that Tales from the Pizzaplex was widely considered to be in the same continuity as the games. And not only did Secret of the Mimic diverge from Tales pretty substantially, but it also seemingly put the possibility of robot people and Afton family involvement back on the table. For those who may have missed it or need a refresher, the long story short of Secret of the Mimic is that there was this guy named Edwin Murray who had a wife named Fiona, a son named David, and two friends named William Afton and Henry Emily. Edwin owned Murray's costume manor, which he inherited from his dad, and was contacted by his friends to help with setting up the first Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. Unfortunately for Edwin, and honestly everyone, Fiona died while helping set up an event called Fall Fest, and while Edwin was grieving, M1 pretended to be her. Then after David died, M1 tried to pressure Edwin into rebuilding David as another Mimic, and Edwin snapped out of his AI psychosis and realized she wasn't actually Fiona and he couldn't just rebuild the family that he had neglected. That's why he put M1 in the Mex's machine, and why he made the M2 program to put in the Mimic endoskeleton instead. Then some of Edwin's employees, or potentially former employees, seeing as William was actively poaching the MCM employees for Fazbear Entertainment, leaked the existence of M2 to Fazbear, which didn't help the potentially already ongoing efforts to drive the Murray's costume manor business into financial ruin, so Fazbear Entertainment could get all of Edwin's stuff. Then M2 started acting like David. Edwin did not take it well and attacked it, and M2 started imitating Edwin and got pretty violent, leading to the events of the game where William did get ownership of all of Edwin's stuff, including the land where his house was built. Edwin went missing due to presumably Mimic-related reasons, and Fazbear sent a bunch of people to Murray's costume manor to get the Mimic out, though most if not all of them died in the process. But the elements of the game that are particularly relevant to the topic of this video are the Murray household and Edwin's son, David. Some of you may know about the theory proposed by another FNAF theorist, TDreads, about a year ago, about David Murray and how he may be connected to both William Afton and Gregory through the Crying Child. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend you check it out, but for the purposes of this video, I'm going to give a quick summary of some of what he goes over for anyone who needs it. TDreads explains that the connections between the Crying Child and Gregory that MatPat points out seem very deliberate in a way that implies more than just circumstantial similarities or even narrative parallels, as well as how there are some notable connections between the two of them and David Murray. After all, David's room looks scarily similar to the bedroom in FNAF 4, a game where, in my estimation, we're most likely playing as Michael Afton, but reliving the Crying Child's memories due to being haunted by him. This room has the same closet doors, some of the same toys, a dresser in the same spot, strikingly similar wallpaper, and even an animatronic hiding in the closet, even if the circumstances are different. Then on top of that, both David and the crying child have plush toys they're closely associated with, and after their deaths may or may not manifest as a teleporting version of that character in the White Tiger and Golden Freddy characters. Additionally, they're both scared of animatronics, at least temporarily on David's part in regards to M1, and if the theory that the crying child's real name is Dave is correct, that would mean their names are almost identical, which is especially weird when you consider the fact that their parents could have easily already been friends before one or both of them were born. And while it's not like it's unthinkable, it would be a little weird in the context of a story being written. Then in the survival logbook, the crying child is asked if his favorite toy is a purple plastic phone, which Secret of the Mimic draws particular attention to as being a toy of David's. It also asks if his favorite ride is the carousel. Meanwhile, the only game we actually see a carousel in that's set before the crying child dies is in Murray's Costume Manor. And yeah, we know that in the FNAF 2 movie it's possible there was a Freddy's carousel at one point the crying child may have been to, but as for the games, this is what we've got. There are a few other connections TDreads makes that I either don't have time for or don't entirely agree with, but either way, the connections between the crying child and David seem to be there. Then factoring in the connections Gregory seems to have to the crying child, and even to David specifically, since it seems like both of them like their little hideaways, as well as this image from Secret of the Mimic of David and M1 sitting together on a hill under a tree, just like Gregory and Glamrock Freddy do after the Burn Trap ending, and it really looks like there are connections between all three of these characters. Even if the most recent arc of games doesn't have the same focus as the original, the fact that Scott and Steelwool found it necessary to create these connections and reinforce them as recently as Secret of the Mimic implies that these characters are related and relevant to what's going on in the current story. More specifically, TDreads theorized that the reason Dave Afton would have so many similarities and connections to David Murray and to Gregory would be because game theory was almost right with the theory that Gregory was a recreation of the crying child, because both the crying child and Gregory would be recreations of David Murray, though not in the robot kid sense. He essentially theorizes that Gregory having good parents despite claiming a family tragedy, talking to a program the therapist first assumes is self-therapy to ask himself questions and repeat phrases back to him to only later realize it's someone else he's talking to, and Gregory liking masks and disguises would be because Gregory is a human kid, but one that had the M2 version of the Mimic program in his head taking over him. It wouldn't be the first time Scott's had a plotline about AI programs taking over people's brains and lives after all, and since M2 had imitated David, that would explain Gregory's connections to David and potentially provide an alternate explanation for why Gregory would be spotted talking to a distorted rabbit figure if that rabbit figure was Mex's, a program meant to contain and protect M2. Similarly, TDreads suggests that the similarities between the crying child and David could be attributed to William Afton seeing what Edwin was able to do with M2 and trying to recreate that just like William did with Henry and his Robo daughters in the Silver Eyes trilogy, which already has a lot of parallels to the most recent arc of games. Specifically, TDreads proposes this would be either a less literal recreation of David, where William sees the White Tiger in MCM and tries to figure out if he can do the same thing by forcing Dave to live as similarly as possible, or it could be a more literal recreation, where William worked with M1 to get David Murray's consciousness, or the M2 version of David Murray's consciousness anyway, into a new vessel, aka the crying child. There are consciousness transfer things between a human and robot both in the games with Glitchtrap and Vanny and in the books with stories like Lonely Freddy, so it's not entirely out of the question. That being said, TDreads mentioned being less confident in his answer for why the crying child is so relevant, or how he'd end up getting M2'd, even if he's convinced of his Gregory theory and couldn't see another way to explain why there'd be so many connections between David and the crying child and them to Gregory. Then at the end of his video, he challenged anyone who disagreed with the theories he suggested to come up with another explanation that explains the connections. And while I do agree with a lot of the points he made in his video, there are some things that come to mind for me that could not only work as a way to explain the crying child's connections to both characters in a way that accounts for all the information we've been given, but would also work with some of the points MatPat made in his theories that shouldn't be taken for granted just because some of the evidence he used for them is a bit outdated. So with that said, let's start with the crying child. The fact that Gregory looks so similar to him has to mean something, and it's pretty obvious just from Secret of the Mimic that both the crying child and David are connected via a lot of stuff from FNAF 4. However, I don't think these similarities are from William wanting to transplant the David part of M2's consciousness into his son. If he really was trying to recreate what Edwin created in M2, presumably he'd either be studying M2 and its mimicry capabilities directly, seeing as Fazbear does seem to get a hold of it, or just try to build one himself to see if he could recreate it. Meanwhile, if he was trying to create something like the White Tiger apparition to study the supernatural, that wouldn't require him needing his son to literally become David Murray, or even have David's identity projected onto him. Just have similar situations to see if that has the same effect. This could be why William based the FNAF 4 Nightmare Experiment chamber on David's room, as well as gave his son a Fredbear plush rather than a white tiger one. If he was trying to recreate David, logically he would find a similar plush to the white tiger, since it's a pretty important plush to him as a character, being his favorite toy ever since he was a baby, which William would probably know being friends with Edwin. So the fact that the crying child has Fredbear instead, and based on the tales from the Pizzaplex book Didophobia, the FNAF 4 bedroom isn't actually the crying child's bedroom in the Afton household, and most likely actually is an experiment room meant to test fear responses in its subjects. If William was trying to turn his son into David, his son's actual room and toys in his normal life would most likely be what was set up like that, not the Nightmare Experiment chamber. Presumably wouldn't be in 24/7, seeing as the crying child does appear to be out and about during the FNAF 4 minigames. It's a point of connection between them, sure, but not really anything that can't easily be explained by either William noticing the white tiger and going, if I set up my Nightmare Experiment room to look like the room of the kid who owned the tiger plush, and give my kid a Fredbear plush while he's going through the Nightmare Torment Nexus, will a Fredbear entity spawn instead? Or William just taking trophies from having run Edwin out of business and ruined his life, like we see him do with his victims in the movie continuity. Additionally, one of the big things TDreads pointed to multiple times in his video as a point of connection between David and the crying child and evidence for William literally trying to voice David's identity onto his son was that both characters have striped shirts, like Gregory and the crying child have. The issue with this is the fact that David actually doesn't have a striped shirt in most, if not all, of his depictions. In the drawing of him with M1, he's wearing a stripeless shirt and overalls. And in the photo of him with his parents, he's wearing a polo that's kind of like Gregory's, but once again doesn't have stripes. The only time we see David in an outfit that could be argued to have stripes is in this photo of David and M1 on a hill together. But even then, the faintly lighter portions of the shirt are at the base of his shirt instead of around the chest, and could easily just be because of the shirt bunching up around his waist in the curve of his back, leading to the creases getting hit by the light. If the striped shirt was really meant to prove that William was turning his son into David, I feel like the stripes would be more visible or on all of David's clothing instead of just maybe one shirt and in the wrong spot. Even the name similarity is probably less telling than it seems at first glance. While I do think it's pretty likely that the crying child is named Dave, considering William's whole deal of taking literally everything from Edwin in the games, it could be a case of him taking the kid's name too out of spite and giving it to his child, like he does with giving his victims toys in the movie to his daughter Vanessa. Additionally, we don't actually know if Dave is short for David, which is what David Murray is exclusively referred to as, and even if William did name his son after Edwin's kid, the fact that there is a difference there, especially when we already have at least two different Jeremys who aren't connected to each other at all outside of a vague association with Freddy's, seems more like a point to them not being meant to have the same identity instead of just being connected. But even with that said, there are implied connections between David, the crying child, and Gregory, and I do think they're all intentional. So if I don't think the crying child was made into David, what would explain why both of these boys have similarities to Gregory? Well, I think that could be explained by what and who Glitchtrap really is. And when I say that, I don't mean whether or not Glitchtrap is literally William Afton at all, or if he's just the mimic pretending to be William. Because either way, the mimic seems to be involved with Glitchtrap, and no matter which mimic was the foundation for Glitchtrap, and even if William isn't actually a part of it, Glitchtrap itself looks a suspicious amount like him. Sure, it's got the mimic's fabric costume thing going on, but it's a fabric version of William's spring Bonnie suit. Then while one ending of Secret of the Mimic, Perilous Help Wanted, having the player trapped in Freddy soup while M2 and Glitchtrap respectively watch on, Glitchtrap gets the player into that position with a funky version of the events of William luring away the kids during the missing children incident, blending something the mimic did with something related to William to create what we get in Help Wanted. Then in Help Wanted's DLC, we see another instance of that blending where there's a Fall Fest event going on, but it isn't in the 70s like the one where Fiona died that would be relevant to the mimic. Instead, it's in 1983, the year that William Afton's youngest son died, and shows the Afton household from FNAF 4 on the hill instead of the Murrays. Even if the mimic is the only entity in Glitchtrap, everything it does manifests through the lens of William Afton, and I think that's why Gregory would have attributes of David, but primarily the crying child. Glitchtrap could very well be trying to create the young son of a family in Gregory, but because it was operating through and merging in William's perspective, the outcome was a child who has a blue polo shirt like David Murray, but in a darker hue with stripes like the crying child. A child who has David's affinity for hidey holes, but instead of liking tigers, is primarily interested in the most recent iteration of Fredbear, Freddy, with his shirt, shoes, and activity in the books being pretty closely connected to that animatronic character. Rather than just being an attempted recreation of the crying child like MatPat originally suggested, or one of David like TDreads proposed, I think it's the most likely scenario that because the mimic has both the mimic and William influences at play, the mimic's desire to recreate David got William Aftonified into Gregory, who looks a whole lot more like the crying child than he does David despite having attributes of both. But even if that explains some of what Gregory has going on, it doesn't quite explain everything. For example, earlier I mentioned that one of the things MatPat originally attributed to being Gregory was the post-it room. Later, a lot of other people suggested it was just the mimic there. However, that runs into issues with the fact that, as far as we know, the murderous endoskeleton was stuck in the basement behind a wall of concrete, as well as the Mix's security system, which appears to have been there for a while. While some have theorized that Gregory was the one to seal off the mimic after security breach with the concrete wall, since he is aware of the endoskeleton in ruin, I personally find it unlikely that he managed to put up and dry out an entire wall of concrete to trap the endoskeleton if it was actively being a problem, instead of it already being restrained by Mixes after being in Fazbear custody for decades. And even if the mimic somehow wasn't successfully contained during that 40-50 year time period, I think it's much more likely that the safeguards to keep it there were there during the Pizzaplex's construction, or even when Henry was setting up the pizzeria simulator location beforehand. Alternatively, if you're on the mimic being burn trap side of the debate, there would presumably be a reason the burn trap claw marks are on the vents going in and out of the mimic's room, rather than, through the door, implying to me that the door wasn't really an option. Plus, seeing as burn trap had the whole charging pod situation and was hanging out in the pizzeria simulator location as of security breach, I doubt he was up in the Pizzaplex setting up the Afton family table and doodling like a small child. Though that is a really funny mental image. Not to mention, the last time the mimic was loose in a building, it was more so killing everyone who set foot inside rather than just hanging out and learning to write. Sure, some of the notes are written in binary, and you could try and argue that if the mimic was copying William, that would explain the Afton-related stuff in the room, but that runs into issues, even ignoring the whole trapped in the basement thing. If the mimic really was copying William, I get the feeling it'd be more inclined towards the killing thing than the doodling. And to be honest, we actually have no idea if the mimic in the games even has the doodling tendency that the book mimic did, with just how wildly different their stories are, and how it seems like the drawings in Secret of the Mimic were probably, or at least possibly, made by David while the mimic was still M1. But either way, the idea that the mimic was the one in this room making all the notes just feels off, especially since we can see these same notes in other areas that are much more reminiscent of a kid hiding out, collecting stuff and setting things up like Gregory is implied to have done. Meanwhile, if it was Gregory in that room like MatPat theorized, that could account for the Afton family stuff and even the writing in binary without having to have the mimic physically present to do so. Gregory had presumably been made to replicate and believe himself to be the crying child due to Glitchtrap being in his head, so Glitchtrap's desire to recreate its family could have manifested through having Gregory literally rebuild the Afton family as staff bots. And the mimic's control over Gregory could also explain why he would be writing in binary like the mimic did in Secret of the Mimic, assuming it wasn't just Gregory being good with technology or a robot like MatPat suggested. However, you may remember that I said the idea of Gregory being glitch-trapped into becoming the kid Glitchtrap would view as its child doesn't explain everything. The thing is, while this idea for Gregory would explain part of the room, and I think it does make the most sense for him to be involved with it, that wouldn't explain all of the room. Take, for example, the sheer number of staff bot heads in the room meant to look like Nightmarionne, a nightmare version of the puppet, and the name of the door texture in the files being Charlie Door. Neither of the kids Gregory would theoretically be replicating at all would have anything to do with the puppet or Charlie, the spirit possessing it, other than MCM seemingly being involved with the design for the animatronic and the crying child maybe having seen the puppet before. It's an association, but not one nearly strong enough to warrant Charlie's name being the one on the door, so something else would have to account for that. Not to mention, at some point before security breach, Gregory ends up no longer under Glitchtrap's control and apparently unable to remember everything he did while glitch-trapped, which presumably has a reason rather than just happening spontaneously. And while none of this contradicts the idea that Gregory was brainwashed into being another kid, it does leave a lot of things open and unexplained without more to go off of, which raises the question of, is there an explanation that would actually account for everything? Well, while it is possible that we don't have the clues necessary to figure out exactly what's going on, based on the evidence we have, there is an explanation that would clean up those loose ends, and it has to do with the Gregbot theory. Many of the points game theory brought up to prove Gregory is a robot don't hold up very well in light of more information that makes it so that Gregory has no need to be a robot in most of the scenarios. And sure, there's the effect on Gregory's vision when Vanny approaches, but without anything else to back it up, why would that be the only solid evidence for Gregory being a robot rather than just a stylistic choice? But the thing is, I don't think that's the only piece of evidence for Gregory being a robot. In fact, there's one piece of evidence that initially convinced me of the Gregbot theory almost a year after Security Breach and MatPat's original theory came out. And that evidence is the sister location room wall code. Despite game theory initially proposing the code was about Michael Afton to explain how Michael could be possessing Glamrock Freddy, I think the code much more directly relates to Gregory during Security Breach. Like I mentioned before, the line about dodge, duck, flash, shoot, crawl, run, crush the bile band connects pretty much exactly to Gregory's actions during the events of the game in his efforts to, in some cases literally, crush the Fazbear band. And a lot of the rest of the message seems to relate to him as well. The beginning of the code talks about a breath they hunt, potentially referring to Gregory, who's being hunted by the Glamrock animatronics and Vanessa. The ending of "Your life, your aim will save those with soul" also could connect to the endings of Security Breach, where the best ending is the one where you save Gregory, Vanessa, and Glamrock Freddy, who's probably possessed and therefore would have a soul. It could also connect to how Gregory's stated goal, when given the choice to leave at the end of the game, is to prevent further disappearances, therefore saving souls. Additionally, with Gregory connecting to and being in some way a recreation or representation of the crying child, the phrase "cry not" seems to invoke that aspect of his character as well, and imply there's a need to tell him to avoid doing that, seeing as, crying is in the crying child's nickname. Similarly, there are the traits listed right before the dodge, duck, flash, shoot, crawl, run bit that are likely meant to apply to Gregory as well. Frit, when used as an adjective, can mean frightened, which Gregory does seem to be during Security Breach, while fraught can similarly mean worried or mean filled with, which works well with the next portion of the code, which altogether would mean that he'd be filled with thought and zest and jest, with zest meaning enjoyment or enthusiasm, and jest meaning an adventure or exploit. Meanwhile, Gregory is an enthusiastic person who enjoys breaking the animatronics to get their parts for Freddy more than he potentially should, and definitely has some adventurous exploits going on, including the one he's currently dealing with during the game. These traits are relatively generic and could apply to a lot of characters depending on how you interpret them, but in combination with the rest of the message afterwards that either directly relates to Security Breach or works really well with Gregory, the fact that it can be applicable to him helps emphasize that it's very likely that everything in this code is meant to apply to Gregory and his story during Security Breach rather than another character. And that is why I think this code very strongly implies that Gregory is a robot. Not only could this come across as instructions for the robot, but this code doesn't just seem to reference the Glamrocks hunting Gregory by saying, "They hunt now drawn to life." It specifically says, "I built the breath they hunt now drawn to life, not real, still keen." Pretty much wherever you assume periods, commas, and semicolons to go, there is a breath that was built. And the clarification of something being not real but still intelligent right after talking about someone being hunted, and right before going into the description of what Gregory's traits and actions are during Security Breach. Even if you try assigning the not real, still keen, and frit and fraught and so on to the Glamrock animatronics, saying that they're scared or having adventurous exploits doesn't really seem to apply to any of them except maybe Freddy, who isn't hunting or being hunted and therefore not applicable here. Not to mention, if they're the breath that was built, that wouldn't work with the Glamrocks being multiple animatronics and breath not being a plural word. Meanwhile, if the breath or life that's not real and being hunted was just the basement mimic, that wouldn't really work either. Not only is it not really being hunted by anyone during main game Security Breach except for maybe Gregory and the Blob if Burntrap's the mimic, and even then that would be a stretch since Gregory seems confused by what and who Burntrap even is, and the Blob's just kinda chilling until it's disturbed during the boss fight rather than either of them actively hunting Burntrap specifically. But the whole bit about being frit and fraught with thought and zest and jest doesn't really apply to the mimic either. It sure doesn't seem fearful whenever we see it, and I wouldn't say it's experiencing enjoyment to qualify for being filled with zest, since as far as we know, the only emotions it could have would be grief and rage that it was infused with by Edwin, nor would it be the one having adventurous exploits in this game. Add in the fact that everything else in this code works as being about Gregory, and to me the code reads like Gregory is the life that's not real, the breath that was built and hunted by the animatronics during Security Breach, but has the ability to think and feel and crush the vile band to save those with soul. I think this code, as well as the CRT vision when Vanny is around, is supposed to point to the conclusion that Gregory is, in fact, a robot. The only real point I can see that would maybe contradict him being a robot would be the fact that we know from the therapy sessions and Tales books that there presumably was a real human Gregory with a family. But even then, Gregory being a robot would work just fine. All that would have to happen would be for there to have been a human Gregory at one point who was kidnapped or killed, with the Gregory we know being constructed and put in place as a fully glitch trap controlled substitute, one who doesn't have a human will that needs to be overridden. We've seen examples of robots taking the place of humans before, with Eleanor and Fazbear Frights using either remnant or illusion disc technology to appear like various humans, as well as the robot version of Charlie that Henry built in the Silver Eyes trilogy. And on the topic of Charlie, even Gregory being listed as human in the FNAF character encyclopedia could be explained by her, since Charlie's page lists her as human despite talking about and having pictures of the Charlie that we know for a fact is a robot. Besides, it's not like instances of robot people or robots taking the place of people aren't on Scott's mind as he writes the current arc of games. The Tales from the Pizzaplex story Help Wanted is about a guy who was knocked out and convinced that he had multiple years worth of amnesia about getting married and having kids, since when he wakes up, there's a woman and some kids claiming that's what happened. Later, he finds out that they were actually robots that he perceived as human due to illusion discs. Meanwhile, another story, Nexie, has an animatronic doll that more or less takes a girl's skin and puts it on an endoskeleton that then goes to school as the girl. and that's just a couple of the Tales books. The novel trilogy also appears to be on Scott's mind as he's writing this current story as well. Other theorists like John FNAF have pointed out that the current arc seems to be drawing from them to some degree, and it definitely seems like that's the case. In the first book, The Silver Eyes, a mall was built over an abandoned Freddy Fazbear's pizza place, just like in Security Breach, where the Pizzaplex was built over the pizzeria from Pizzeria Simulator. The second book had technology that modified people's perceptions of the world and an underground waterfall, while the Ruin DLC for Security Breach and Help Wanted 2 had the Vanny mask and occipital lobe transponders, modifying the way that Cassie and her father perceived the world, with Ruin also having an underground waterfall. Meanwhile, the third book reveals that both the main protagonist, Charlie, and one of the primary antagonists, Elizabeth Afton, are robot recreations of Henry Emily's daughter at different stages of life, just with one being haunted by the spirit of one of William Afton's children. Meanwhile, in the games, we have two characters that are potentially robots and have connections to David Murray, just with one of them looking much more like one of William Afton's children. And that leads to the final question of this video. Is Gregory actually haunted? But even if the games are mirroring elements of the books and Gregory is in fact a robot, that doesn't guarantee they're also taking the situation of one of William's kids possessing a robot that has the traits of the child of a guy he screwed over due to how it was created. Many of the crying child's similarities are things that can be explained by the whole glitch trap trying to recreate its child thing. And even if Scott does seem to like using the various FNAF books as first drafts for things that may be modified for the games, that doesn't mean it has to be exactly the same situation. But when considering a few things from the terminology of the wall code to the core themes of the games and the story they've been telling, I'm led to believe that Gregory is something more than just a robot literally replacing a kid. While the wall code does seem to imply that Gregory was built and isn't real, I do think it's significant that it says that what was built is a breath, and that Gregory's life and aim will save those with soul. In Pizzeria Simulator's Insanity ending, when Henry talks about William's victims, he says he doesn't know how those tiny breaths of life came to inhabit those machines, referring to the spirits as breaths of life. If the usage of breath here is similar, that could work with how, despite being built and not a real human, Gregory could also be said to have a life. And it could even be an artificially created one rather than one sourced from the crying child. After all, in the novel trilogy, the Charlie robot wasn't possessed by the spirit of Charlie Emily at all, but rather by the emotions and memories related to her in her passing that Henry was experiencing while grieving her, which created a sort of artificial soul within the doll that powered the robot Charlie, in contrast to the Charlie bot William stole and modified, who was brought to life by both Henry's emotions as he built her and the spirit of Elizabeth Afton. In fact, I think Gregory being possessed either by a human spirit or an artificial soul would explain how he managed to break free of Glitchtrap's control to the point that Glitchtrap doesn't really seem to have any influence over him during Security Breach. After all, as far as we can tell, normal robots aren't able to resist Glitchtrap. Vanessa mentions being able to compartmentalize him in her mind during her therapy sessions, and even if she is still working for him because she's terrified of what'll happen to her if she doesn't, she was at least able to compartmentalize him to some degree. Similarly, Freddy is able to resist Burntrap's control in the Burntrap ending long enough to recognize Burntrap as a him and warn Gregory about Burntrap and the other Glamrocks while Burntrap isn't actively pressing his hand against the screen to take control of Freddy in a way that none of the other glitch-trapped Glamrocks require. This could connect to how right before the fight and before Burntrap is even awake to hack him, Freddy has this whole thing about how now that he has the ability to choose, he'll protect Gregory, and also that he's not himself. I genuinely don't see an option for Freddy other than him being possessed in some way or another, especially with the whole second wind thing while out of power, which isn't how robots work. And I find it notable that even when he was captured by Vanessa and it became possible for him to attack Gregory when on low power or if his repairs are messed up, it's a change he mentions being aware of. Glitchtrap is in him, but is only able to take over when he's actively being tampered with or too drained of power to fight back. I think in both these cases, having a soul is what sets them apart and makes them able to compartmentalize Glitchtrap even if imperfectly. Meanwhile, a completely robot Gregory would presumably just be in the same situation as the Glamrocks. But during Security Breach, he's not just resisting Glitchtrap like Freddy or compartmentalizing it like Vanessa, but as far as we can tell, he's completely free from Glitchtrap's influence despite very much being controlled by him before, something that I don't think would be possible for him without the presence of a soul. And while I think an artificial or real human spirit could work, I think that it's pretty likely that Gregory is possessed by an actual human spirit, and my main reason for that is his memories, or rather, his lack thereof. One thing that's established across the various FNAF media is that the dead tend to forget. Not everything, but the missing kids in both the books and the movies are unable to remember that William Afton is the one who killed them, up until they're shown the truth. Additionally, one of the boys in the Tales books doesn't even realize he's a ghost and can't process when his death is spoken about around him until he finds his own dead body, which brings back his memories of his death and the things he struggled to remember afterward. Meanwhile, we have Gregory, who despite stalking Vanessa in therapy and working under Glitchtrap, doesn't know who Vanessa, Vanny, or Burntrap even are. He remembers some things, like his friendship with Cassie and that people are going missing, but he doesn't seem to know why when he really should. If he was a robot possessed by a human spirit, though, that would explain the lapses in memory, as well as how he would suddenly not be completely controlled by Glitchtrap. Not to mention, any differences in personality that exist between the human Gregory wouldn't really matter, since spirits are typically bound by the programming of the animatronic they're possessing. Hence why Circus Baby has such a big willingness to kill people for William, and Glamrock Freddy acts like Freddy despite probably being possessed because he canonically has a personality chip influencing him. And if the spirit possessing Gregory is the crying child, that could be why Gregory is able to play the Princess Quest games. The crying child spirit would be around at all because he was presumably in Golden Freddy alongside the vengeful spirit of Ultimate Custom Night. Meanwhile, the Princess Quest games seem to imply that the princess is the vengeful spirit. There's Ultimate Custom Night imagery, a guy who Help Wanted 2 confirms to be OMC, presumably short for Old Man Consequences, who tells the princess to rest just like Old Man Consequences did in Ultimate Custom Night, and the princess has beef with the manifestation of something that either is or looks like he should be William and says his catchphrase. The princess also has a shadow variant just like Golden Freddy does, so I really think that the princess is meant to be the Golden Freddy spirit, and as such, may have a greater willingness to trust Gregory than she would other people. And then of course, there's the Post-it note room and its connections to both the Afton family and Charlotte Emily. But first, if you made it this far in the video, I assume you're enjoying it so far, so make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Apparently YouTube has been struggling to actually show content to people recently, and at least that increases your chances that you'll actually see more videos like this in your feed. But anyway, unlike the novel trilogy, Charlie's spirit is very relevant in the games. Not only is she the spirit in the Marionette, but one of the minigames in FNAF 2, called Give Gifts, Give Life, shows her giving life to the Freddy's animatronics haunted by the victims of the missing children incident. We don't know exactly what she did, but presumably she was involved with the process of those animatronics becoming possessed. And since her name is on the door, not to mention the puppet mask and the blob notably lacks the tears it gained from her possession, I think it's highly likely that Charlie's spirit relocated, potentially bringing the crying child's spirit along for the ride, and is involved with this room, and that she is the one who gave life to Gregory. While it's possible the room was for helping a newly made robot kid act the way Glitchtrap wanted him to, the amount of Charlie involvement makes it seem more likely that this would be something else, since I don't really think it would make sense for her to be working with Glitchtrap based on who she is as a character, and there would need to be a reason for her to be tied to an otherwise Afton-related room. As such, I think it makes more sense for this room to be showing signs that Charlie was communicating with the newly unglitch-trapped Gregory, who had just been hit with the partial amnesia beam alongside a human spirit and was probably disoriented enough to fall back on asking why he existed in a robot's native binary to help him put together who he's supposed to be. Charlie's involvement also might be why Gregory is able to more fully shake off Glitchtrap's influence. Her being involved with giving life could have stabilized his connection to his body and made the identity strong enough to fully withstand him. After all, the notes in the room don't seem to be written like one person is talking to themselves, as much as they seem to be written by multiple children who are actually communicating. The various notes seem to come in distinct groupings on their texture files of thin and scribbly, thinner and less scribbly, and neater, primarily crayon-drawn words and images. However, despite being on the page that looks like it would be earliest in the order of progression under the idea of someone developing their motor functions and writing abilities, the very first note on the page is one that, in much clearer handwriting, says, "This is my home, leave." And while I don't think the notes are in chronological order, the fact that this note is so prominently placed both here and in the room itself makes it stand out to me as more than just a general request for any trespassers who could happen upon the room to leave, or something that Glitchtrap would make Gregory write for some reason. Instead, it could be a sign that there were actually multiple people in that room, one being Gregory, and one being either some sort of physical entity possessed by, or even just the spirit of Charlie Emily, which we know from the books would be possible since spirits have been shown to make physical drawings. What really hammered the possibility home for me is that it does seem like a lot of the notes are addressing someone else. There are notes that say hello and goodbye, stop and go, no, hide, and you are Afton family instead of the first person I and my that we see in different notes. I think that one in particular, along with the majority of the notes with poorer handwriting, makes the most sense to be written by Charlie, trying to show the crying child who he is and help him be more stabilized as an entity, to put him back together, to reference FNAF 4. There are some other notes in there that I go over in a previous video of mine, and I do think there's room for error with this interpretation, but I personally think this explains the post-it room better than either hand-waving how the physical mimic would have gotten between here and the basement, as well as all the Charlie and Puppet relevant stuff related to the room. And if Charlie was involved, that would explain how Gregory got possessed and why this room is so weird. But at the end of the day, what I really think makes it make sense for Gregory to be a haunted robot rather than just a human kid or even just a robot is the fact that it would work perfectly with the themes that the current arc of games and what Scott himself has said he tries to include in Five Nights at Freddy's story. One thing I've often seen brought up about the idea of various characters being possessed is that it would make more sense for the current arc to be about technology becoming so advanced that it basically takes on a life of its own. While another stemming from that and the introduction of the Mimic as a character is the idea that possession and ghosts just aren't relevant to the current arc. So everything has to be the Mimic in some way or another. And I do see where that line of thought comes from. The Mimic is a central character to the current story arc of the games, being an important antagonist pretty regularly even if buried under William's influence as Glitchtrap, which would be the first time we were technically introduced to a character that at least partially consists of the Mimic's AI. And that's the thing about the Mimic. It's just an AI. One that the Tales from the Pizzaplex books implies is partially infused with Edwin's rage, but one that, in Secret of the Mimic, is shown to fall short of actually being the people it tries to imitate. When M1 is imitating Fiona, she noticeably acts more passive and robotic than the real Fiona ever did. And Edwin's whole character arc in the games is realizing that his grief over the loss of the real Fiona had blinded him to the fact that M1 wasn't actually her, and that he had gotten so wrapped up in his work that he had neglected to spend time with his living son until it was too late and David was gone as well. And if the Mimic is the villain of the story as an AI that was used to replicate a person but went rogue because at the end of the day it's just an AI its creator couldn't make actually alive, I think it would make sense for Gregory to be a foil to that. For him to be a robot that was only able to be made alive at all because, despite being a robot, he was given a human soul. Genuine humanity would be what frees him from Glitchtrap's power and changes him from a tool for violence with a programmed history and robotic tendencies into an actual person with his own life and desires like the wall code suggests. And while you could argue this theme would work just as well with him being a human, we do have other human characters who could fill that role, and not only would Gregory being a haunted robot work well with the evidence I've already presented, but it would come together perfectly with something Scott mentioned during his interview. In it, Scott mentioned that he has a tendency to lean sci-fi, which a lot of people took to mean that he was going pretty much full sci-fi with the current arc. The thing is, Scott followed that up by saying that he always tries to come back to the supernatural. So his affinity for sci-fi means that he really likes to include possession of AI, machines, and circuitry. And while this specifically was in response to a question about Glitchtrap, which is part of why I tend to lean on the idea that Glitchtrap is the result of the Mimic being possessed by William rather than just copying him, I think it's something that almost certainly applies to other characters just as well. That's part of why I think it makes sense for Glamrock Freddy to be possessed, and I think it would make sense for the crying child to potentially haunt Gregory if he isn't haunted by someone else instead. For Gregory to be a robot built to replace a real child and take over the life of another, but end up becoming a person himself when he gains a spirit of his own, something the Mimic endoskeleton doesn't possess. Haunted robots have always been at the core of the Five Nights at Freddy's franchise, and even if Scott is leaning more sci-fi as time goes on, I don't think the supernatural or haunted machines have gone by the wayside, even if I am wrong about Gregory. But at the end of the day, that's just a theory, and whenever the next game comes out, I'll be looking forward to seeing what the story really has in store. In the meantime, don't forget to order one of the remaining ID's Fantasy pin sets before they're gone forever using the link in the description, and check out Mantis Sleep for a 10% discount using my link or code ID's Fantasy. Thank you so much for watching, don't get stabbed, and have a nice day.